On the 22nd of May, 1885, the body of Victor Hugo lay in state beneath the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, the greatest monument in France, built to honor the armies of Napoleon, draped in black for a man who had never commanded a single soldier. 2 million people came. They walked through the streets of Paris through the night and into the morning. Workers and senators, school children and philosophers, people who had never read a word he wrote, and people who had read every word twice. The procession to the Panthéon stretched for miles. It was the largest public gathering in French history to that point, and by most accounts, the most genuinely felt. Victor Hugo had wanted this. He had wanted it with a clarity and a patience that most men reserve for things they are not certain they will receive. He had spent his entire adult life constructing not just a body of work, but a position, a meaning, a place in the permanent record of civilization. And on that May morning in 1885, it was clear that he had succeeded beyond almost any measure available. This is the story of Victor Hugo. He was the author of Les Misérables, the novel that had made Jean Valjean and Inspector Javert and Fantine into figures that readers across the world recognized as though they were real. He was the author of Notre-Dame de Paris, the book that had saved the Gothic architecture of France by making people fall in love with it. He was the poet of Les Contemplations, the playwright of Hernani, the political exile who had refused to return to France until liberty returned with him. He was, by every public measurement, the conscience of a nation. And then there is the other story, the story that the 2 million people in the streets could not have told you because most of them did not know it. The story of the man behind the monument, the private Victor Hugo, who kept notebooks that his literary executors found deeply uncomfortable, who pursued women throughout a 50-year relationship with the person who loved him most completely, who learned of his daughter's death by reading a stranger's newspaper at a cafe table while traveling with his mistress, and who did not rush home, who preached mercy in every novel he ever wrote and dispensed it, in his private life, with a selectivity that the novels themselves would not have recognized as grace. This is the question the documentary will spend its time answering, not who Victor Hugo was in the streets of Paris on the day of his funeral, but who he was in the rooms where nobody was watching, and whether those two men, the public prophet and the private person, were at war with each other, or whether they were, in some way we are still trying to understand, the same man all along. 2 million people mourned him, but the woman who had loved him for 50 years had been dead for 2 years already, and the daughter whose loss had cracked him open and made his greatest work possible had been dead for 42 years. The story of Victor Hugo, the real one, begins long before the crowds. It begins in a world that was already violently remaking itself. Before we continue, if you find yourself drawn to documentaries that go beneath the public surface of great lives, into the private contradictions and the human costs behind the celebrated names, then subscribe to The Long Shadow. It helps this channel reach more thoughtful viewers, and I am genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching from tonight? To understand what shaped Victor Hugo, you have to understand what France was in the first years of the 19th century. Because France in 1802 was not a stable country with a clear identity. It was a country that had just spent a decade tearing itself apart and was now watching a single man attempt to put it back together through sheer force of personality and military genius. 13 years before Hugo's birth, the French Revolution had dismantled an entire world, the monarchy gone, the aristocracy scattered, the church stripped of its authority. The old social order, which had organized French life for centuries, had been demolished with a speed and a violence that stunned the rest of Europe and left France itself unsure of what it had become. What followed was not peace. It was the terror, and then the Directory, and then the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, who by 1800 had made himself first consul, and by 1804 would make himself emperor. He was, depending on your position, either the savior of the revolution's ideals or the man who had betrayed them for personal ambition. Both were true, which was part of why he was so difficult to look away from. The France that Victor Hugo was born into was Napoleon's France, a country of extraordinary energy and profound contradiction. A country that had declared the rights of man and was simultaneously building an empire on military conquest. A country where careers were open to talent, where a Corsican officer's son could become emperor, but where the gap between the celebrated few and the suffering many remained vast and largely unexamined. This tension between the grand proclamation and the lived reality, between the rhetoric of liberty and the fact of poverty, would become the central preoccupation of Hugo's life. Not because he was born poor, he was not, but because he was born into a world where the gap was visible, where it announced itself every day in the streets of whatever city his father's military postings dragged the family to next. The literary world Hugo entered as a young man was equally unsettled. France had a literary tradition of enormous prestige and considerable rigidity. The classical rules governing what poetry and theatre could do, what language was acceptable, what subjects were worthy, had been in place for 2 centuries. They were not rules that welcomed disruption. And Victor Hugo, from the very beginning, was disruption. The world he was born into made that almost inevitable. A country that had just shattered its own past had created the conditions for a literature that would shatter its own past as well. Hugo would not simply be a great writer in the French tradition. He would be the writer who remade what that tradition was allowed to be. That story was still decades away when he arrived, but the ground had already been prepared. Victor Marie Hugo was born on the 26th of February 1802 in Besançon in eastern France, the third son of a general and a royalist, which is to say, he was born into a household at war with itself before he could speak. His father, Joseph Léopold Sigisbert Hugo, was a man of genuine military ability and considerable personal ambition. He had risen through the ranks of Napoleon's army on the strength of his competence and his loyalty, and he would eventually reach the rank of general. He was also frequently absent. The nature of Napoleon's campaigns meant that a soldier with Leopold's rank was rarely in one place for long, and so the Hugo household moved. Besançon, to Elba, to Corsica, to Paris, to Avellino in Italy, later, most significantly, to Madrid, where Leopold served under Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, who had been installed as King of Spain. Victor was a child of these journeys. He would later draw on the memory of Spain, its landscapes, its scale, its dramatic contrasts of poverty and grandeur. For the rest of his life, he would carry a visual imagination shaped partly by those early years of movement. His mother, Sophie Trebuchet, was the fixed point in this itinerant life. A woman of strong convictions and stronger opinions, Sophie was a committed royalist who had no sympathy for everything her husband served. She had her own life in Paris when Leopold was away, her own friendships, her own political sympathies, and eventually her own affair. With General Victor Lahorie, an old friend of the family who had become involved in royalist conspiracies against Napoleon, and who was the man after whom Victor Hugo had been named. This is the surprising detail that the standard biography tends to soften. Victor Hugo was named for a man who was almost certainly his mother's lover, and who was, for a time, hiding in the Hugo family home to escape arrest. General Lahorie was eventually captured and executed in 1812. Victor was 10 years old. What does it do to a child to grow up between parents whose entire worldview is in opposition? To have a father who represents the Napoleonic order and a mother who shelters the men working against it? To have your own name come from that divided loyalty? It produces, in some people, a profound uncertainty about where they stand. In Victor Hugo, it seems to have produced something different. a determination to stand everywhere, to be large enough to contain the contradiction rather than resolve it. His politics throughout his life would shift repeatedly, from royalism to liberalism to republicanism, and his admirers would call it growth, while his critics called it opportunism. The truth was probably that he had been trained from birth to hold opposing things simultaneously and call it not confusion, but complexity. He was a child who read voraciously, who wrote early, who absorbed everything around him with an intensity that his mother recognized and encouraged. When the family eventually separated formally, Victor went to Paris to live with Sophie. He was educated at home and in small schools. He was slight, serious, and already, by his early adolescence, unmistakably hungry for something larger than the life around him. His father was a general who rarely came home. His mother was a woman who spent years fighting a war her husband had already chosen a side in. Victor Hugo grew up in the gap between them and would spend his entire life trying to fill it with words. In a notebook that has survived from his early adolescence, Victor Hugo wrote a line that his biographers have been quoting ever since. He wrote that he wanted to be Chateaubriand, or nothing. François-René de Chateaubriand was the dominant figure of French letters in the early 19th century, a writer of enormous stylistic prestige, deeply associated with the romantic sensibility that was beginning to reshape European literature. To want to be Chateaubriand at 15 was an enormous ambition, but the line is interesting for another reason. It already contained the characteristic Hugo move, the refusal of the middle ground. Chateaubriand or nothing, not simply a writer, not a good writer, the defining one. What drove this was not simple vanity, though vanity was certainly present. It was something closer to a vocation. Hugo genuinely believed, from very early in his life, that he had been placed in the world to do something permanent, to produce work that would outlast him in the way that Homer's work had outlasted Homer, in the way that Virgil and Dante had outlasted their centuries. He wanted to be, in the most literal sense, immortal through language. This is an unusual ambition to carry at 15. It is an even more unusual one to carry consistently for the next 70 years, never quite releasing it, never fully doubting it. Most people who want great things learn, eventually, to modulate the wanting. Hugo never did. He was a child of remarkable precocity. His early poetry exercises, done for school competitions, displayed a technical command that astonished his teachers. He absorbed classical forms and romantic influences simultaneously, turning them over in his mind and producing work that already had his fingerprints on it. Clarity of image, emotional directness, a sense of scale that kept pressing against whatever form it was trying to inhabit. He won his first prize from the prestigious Académie des Jeux Floraux in Toulouse at 14. He won it again at 15 and again at 16. By the time he was 17, the Académie Française had recognized him with a special distinction. These were not encouragements. These were confirmations of something he already knew. But the ambition had a cost that would not become fully visible for years. A person who has decided, at 15, that he is destined for permanent greatness is a person who has already, in some sense, organized his interior life around his own legacy. The relationship with other people, the ordinary human commerce of love and reciprocity and vulnerability, tends to occupy a secondary position in that arrangement. Not because such a person cannot feel. Hugo felt intensely, but his feelings were processed through the machinery of a self already oriented toward its own importance. Love, grief, friendship, politics, all of it would eventually become material, fuel for the work. The work was the point. He was 17 years old, winning prizes and writing verse at a speed that impressed everyone around him, and already the distance between the extraordinary boy and the people who loved him was being established. It would widen steadily for the next 7 decades. He was 15 years old, and already certain of his greatness. The question was not whether the world would recognize him. The question, the one he never quite asked himself clearly enough, was what he would have to become to be recognized on the terms he had chosen. Victor Hugo married Adèle Fouché on the 12th of October 1822. He was 20 years old, she was 21. They had known each other since childhood. Their families were connected. Their early friendship had deepened into something that Hugo described in letters with an ardor that was entirely genuine. He loved her. The letters from this period are not the letters of a young man performing emotion for effect. They are the letters of someone genuinely overwhelmed by feeling and by the fear of losing it. His mother Sophie had opposed the match. She died in June of 1821, before the marriage took place, which meant that the final obstacle removed itself, though the timing gave Hugo's early married life a slightly complicated emotional texture. He had wanted both things, his mother's approval and his marriage, and had ended up with neither her blessing nor her living presence. The first years were, by most accounts, genuinely happy. Hugo was prolific and celebrated. His first published collection of poetry, Odes et Poésies diverses, appeared in 1822, the same year he married, and received enough attention that Louis XVIII awarded him a royal pension. He was 20 years old, newly married, and already receiving royal recognition. The trajectory seemed entirely clear. Adèle was not a passive figure in these early years. She was intelligent and warm, a woman who took their domestic life seriously and who engaged genuinely with Hugo's work. They had 5 children together between 1823 and 1835. Their first child, a son named Leopold, died in infancy in 1823. Their eldest surviving daughter was Leopoldine, born in 1824. Then Charles, François Victor, and the youngest daughter Adèle, born in 1830, who would later carry a different kind of shadow through the story. But something was already shifting beneath the surface of the marriage. Hugo's literary ambitions were pulling him outward, into salons and literary circles and the emerging battles of the Romantic movement. And in those circles, he encountered Charles-Augustin Sainte-Beuve. Sainte-Beuve was one of the most significant literary critics of the period. He was also Hugo's close friend, and he was, beginning somewhere in the late 1820s, conducting an affair with Adèle. The precise timeline remains historically uncertain. What is not uncertain is that Hugo knew or suspected, and that his response was to work harder, to publish more, to push further into the public arena rather than confront what was happening in his private one. Whether this was avoidance or pride, or simply the behavior of a man who had always prioritized the work, is a question the record leaves genuinely open. What is clear is that by the early 1830s, the interior architecture of the Hugo marriage had already been compromised. The household continued to function, the children were raised, the famous literary dinners continued, but the intimacy that had characterized the early years was not recovered. He had won the prizes he wanted, married the girl he loved, and set himself on the path to literary greatness. Everything was in place, and Sainte-Beuve had already begun visiting more often than was strictly necessary. In 1827, Victor Hugo published a preface. Ostensibly, it was the preface to a new verse drama he had written about Oliver Cromwell, the 17th-century English revolutionary. The play itself was never performed. It was far too long, architecturally peculiar, and probably unperformable on any practical stage. But the preface was something else entirely. The Cromwell preface was a manifesto, a declaration of war against 2 centuries of French classical literary doctrine, written with the confidence of a man who believed he was announcing the future. Classical French literature, in the tradition running from Racine through the 18th century, operated according to strict principles, the 3 unities: time, place, action. The separation of genres, Comedy here, tragedy there, never in the same work. The hierarchy of subjects, noble themes for serious art, low subjects for lesser forms, and perhaps most significantly, a doctrine of what language was acceptable, elevated diction for elevated subjects, no mixing, no contamination. Hugo read all of this as a prison, and in the Cromwell preface, he broke the walls down with considerable precision. His central argument was this: life does not separate the tragic from the comic. The sublime and the grotesque coexist in all human experience. A great funeral can contain an inappropriate laugh. A moment of terror can produce absurdity. A beautiful person can be destroyed by something ugly and small. Literature that refuses to acknowledge this is not elevated. It is simply incomplete. He called this the principle of the grotesque and the sublime together, and he illustrated it through the history of world literature, from ancient drama through Shakespeare, arguing that the greatest works had always contained both registers simultaneously. It was only the particular rigidity of the French tradition that had tried to force them apart. This was not just an aesthetic argument, it was a philosophical one. Hugo was saying that truth required complexity, that a literature capable only of the beautiful was a literature that could not honestly represent what it meant to be human. He was 25 years old when he wrote it. The reception from the literary establishment was predictably hostile. Critics who had built their careers on the classical tradition recognized exactly what Hugo was doing and objected strenuously. But for an entire generation of young writers and artists, the preface landed like a door being opened into a room they had been pressing against for years. Théophile Gautier would describe reading it as one of the formative experiences of his life. Eugène Delacroix, Hector Berlioz, Alfred de Vigny, they were all circling the same instinct from different artistic directions. Hugo had given that instinct a theoretical foundation and a rallying point. He had not merely written a preface, he had organized a movement, and he had done it with the characteristic Hugo combination of genuine intellectual insight and perfect self-positioning. The Romantic movement would have emerged without him, but it would not have had a leader, and Hugo understood, from the beginning, that movements need leaders the way armies need generals. He had conquered French literary theory. Now he needed a stage. On the 25th of February 1830, the Comédie Française in Paris opened its doors for the premiere of a new verse drama by Victor Hugo. The play was called Hernani, and what followed was not simply a theatrical evening, it was a battle. Hugo had organized it that way deliberately. He understood that the Cromwell preface had established the theoretical argument for Romanticism, but that theory alone would not break the classical hold on French cultural life. What was needed was a public confrontation, a moment sufficiently visible and sufficiently dramatic that it could not be ignored or qualified away. He distributed free tickets, printed on red cardstock, to several hundred young romantics, artists, poets, painters, writers. Théophile Gautier came in a scarlet waistcoat that became one of the most famous articles of clothing in French literary history. He was 19 years old. Honoré de Balzac was there, Alfred de Vigny, Gérard de Nerval. The gathering was a generation's worth of talent packed into the theatre stalls with explicit instructions to applaud and to fight back against whatever the classicists threw at them. The classicists had also organized. They came prepared to boo, to hiss, to shout down anything that violated the rules they believed the stage existed to protect. And Hernani gave them material. The play opened with a line that violated classical verse doctrine in its very first syllable. Hugo had done that on purpose too. What followed was chaos spread over multiple performances. The audience brawled. Critics published furious denunciations. Hugo's supporters returned night after night to defend the production. The newspapers covered the controversy with the intensity usually reserved for political events, because in France in 1830, this essentially was a political event. The battle over what literature was allowed to do was also a battle over what kind of society France was becoming. Hernani ran for 37 performances. By any commercial measure, it was a success. By any cultural measure, it was a turning point. French Romanticism had won the stage. But this section of Hugo's story deserves a pause, because the Battle of Hernani, as it became known, was also the moment when the relationship between Hugo and his public began to take on a quality that would define the rest of his life. He was not simply a writer who had achieved recognition. He was a figure, a standard around which people organized themselves. And that kind of position, once established, becomes its own demand. To remain the leader of a movement, you must continue to move. You cannot consolidate, cannot pause, cannot turn inward. Every silence is read as retreat. Every personal uncertainty is politically inconvenient. And so Hugo, from 1830 onward, was a man pressed from both sides by the ambition that drove him toward perpetual public achievement and by the private life that was, quietly, beginning to collapse. He had conquered the theatre. The critics had been routed. He was 28 years old and the most talked-about writer in France. And at home, Adele was increasingly alone. In 1831, Victor Hugo published Notre-Dame de Paris. In English, the book would eventually become known as The Hunchback of Notre-Dame, though that title is a later translator's choice that Hugo himself never used and would probably have resisted. He named it for the cathedral, not the character. That distinction matters enormously. Hugo wrote the book partly out of love for Gothic architecture and partly out of rage at what was happening to it. France in the 1820s and 30s was in the process of demolishing, modifying, or simply neglecting some of the finest medieval buildings in Europe. The Cathedral of Notre-Dame itself was in a state of considerable disrepair. Hugo had watched this happening and had found himself unable to write an architectural argument persuasive enough to change it, so he wrote a novel instead. His calculation was correct. Notre-Dame de Paris became one of the most widely read novels in France within months of publication, and within a few years the cathedral had become a national obsession rather than a national embarrassment. The restoration campaign that eventually transformed Notre-Dame, led by the architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc beginning in 1844, can be traced in a direct line back to Hugo's novel, creating a public that suddenly cared. A work of literature changed the physical shape of a building that still stands today. That is not a common thing. But the novel's deeper importance lies not in architectural advocacy, but in what Hugo discovered he could do with a character who was genuinely, grotesquely, physically deformed. Quasimodo, the bell ringer of Notre-Dame, was deaf, nearly blind in one eye, hunchbacked, and by the visual standards of his world, a monster. He was also, in the novel, the character most capable of genuine love, most capable of self-sacrifice, most capable of the kind of feeling that the beautiful, socially integrated characters around him could not sustain. Hugo was working out, in fiction, what he would spend the rest of his life arguing in various forms, that the condemned, the excluded, the physically or socially marked, were not inferior to the people who condemned them. They were frequently more fully human. The society that pushed them to its margins was not protecting its best values. It was betraying them. Quasimodo was the first of Hugo's great characters in this line. Jean Valjean would be the last and most fully realized. But they shared the same essential structure, a person society had decided to discard, who contained within himself a capacity for grace that the discarding society had forfeited. The irony embedded in this, which would not become fully legible for many years, is that Hugo understood this kind of loneliness from the inside, not the physical kind, not the poverty or the imprisonment, but the isolation of a person whose interior life does not match the face they present to the world. The man who wrote Quasimodo understood something about living at a distance from the people around him, even when surrounded by them. He just never said so directly. He said it through his characters instead, and perhaps that was the point. He had written a monster who was more human than any of the beautiful people surrounding him. The irony, which would only become clear much later, was that Hugo understood that kind of loneliness in ways that his public life made very difficult to admit. In 1833, Hugo was working on a new play called Lucrece Borgia. For the role of the Princess Negroni, he cast a young actress named Juliette Drouet. She had not had a major theatrical career. She was known more for her beauty than for her performances. The role was not large. What happened between them in the weeks of rehearsal and production is not fully documented. What is known is that by the time Lucrece Borgia opened in February of 1833, they were involved, and that the involvement did not end. It continued, in various forms, through every change of circumstance that Hugo's life would bring, through exile, through political upheaval, through the deaths of people they both knew, until Juliette's own death 50 years later in 1883. Juliette Drouet was not a simple person. She was intelligent, deeply literate, emotionally complex, and possessed of a quality that is hard to name precisely, but that comes through clearly in the more than 20,000 letters she wrote to Hugo over the course of their relationship. She was devoted, not in the passive sense of a person who has no other options, in the active sense of a person who had examined her options and made a choice that she then honored with a consistency that remains, across the historical record, genuinely striking. She gave up her theatrical career at Hugo's request, or at his strong suggestion, which in the context of their relationship amounted to much the same thing. She lived modestly, often in rooms near wherever Hugo was staying, available when he needed her, invisible when he needed her to be invisible. She copied his manuscripts by hand, page after page, keeping his words organized when his own creative chaos would have scattered them. She traveled with him to Guernsey during the exile years, living in a smaller house near Hauteville House, present but not publicly acknowledged in the way that a wife is acknowledged. And she wrote him letters, every day, sometimes multiple times a day, for 50 years. The letters that survive are remarkable documents. They are tender and articulate and honest about what she was asking for and what she was not receiving. She knew, throughout the relationship, that Hugo pursued other women. She said so, in the letters, with a directness that makes the modern reader uncomfortable. She stayed anyway. What Hugo gave her in return is genuinely harder to characterize. He was not indifferent to her. The evidence is clear that he cared for her, relied on her, and found in her a stability that his marriage had long since stopped providing. He wrote her letters too, though fewer, and in his private journals he described the relationship with something approaching honest appreciation. When she was seriously ill, he was present and attentive in ways that suggested real feeling. But he never married her, though he was a widower after 1868, and the legal obstacle had been removed. He never fully chose her, in the sense of organizing his life around her the way she had organized her life around him. He accepted the 50 years of devotion as something he was owed, rather than as something that cost her. This is the fact that sits at the center of Hugo's private life and refuses to be sentimentalized away. The man who would write, in Les Misérables, about characters who sacrifice everything for love, who endure every kind of loss in service of something they believe in, was himself the daily beneficiary of exactly that kind of sacrifice. He received it, he processed it, he perhaps even felt, in his way, grateful for it. He just could not quite bring himself to match it. She would spend 50 years waiting for him to choose her entirely. He never did, and yet she stayed, writing him letters, copying his pages, forgiving things that had no adequate name. The question is not why she stayed. The question, the one that hangs over everything Hugo ever wrote about love, is what he knew about himself in the moments when he accepted it. By the mid-1830s, Victor Hugo was no longer simply a literary figure. He was becoming something else, something that France did not have a precise category for, but recognized immediately when it appeared. He was becoming a public moral voice. This had not been his original orientation. The young Hugo, who had won royal prizes and celebrated the Bourbon monarchy in his early verse, was a cultural conservative with aristocratic literary instincts and no particular appetite for political controversy. His royalism in the early years was not cynical. He came by it honestly, through his mother's influence and through the cultural atmosphere of the post-Napoleonic Restoration. He believed, or thought he believed, in the France of legitimate monarchy. But the 1830s changed him. The July Revolution of 1830 replaced the reactionary Charles X with the more liberal Louis Philippe. Hugo watched it. He thought about what he had watched, and he began, gradually but then with increasing acceleration, to revise his understanding of where he stood. The poetry collections of this period track the shift. Les Feuilles d'automne, Autumn Leaves, published in 1831, was still primarily intimate. Poems about childhood, memory, the passage of time, the experience of fatherhood. They were widely loved precisely because they were accessible and warm, without being politically demanding. But Les Chants du Crépuscule, Songs of Twilight, from 1835, and Les Voix intérieures, Inner Voices, from 1837, began to introduce a different register. The political world was entering the poetry. The suffering of the poor was entering the poetry. The question of what France owed its citizens who were not comfortable, who were not celebrated, who were simply living in the conditions that industrial and social inequality had created, was entering the poetry. Hugo had been walking through Paris for years with his eyes open. He had been collecting observations, documenting what he saw, building what would eventually become the notebooks known as shows of vue. And what he saw in the streets of Paris was a distance between the rhetoric of French civilization and the reality of French poverty that he could not make peace with. He accepted a peerage from King Louis Philippe in 1845, a seat in the Chamber of Peers, the upper house of the French Parliament under the constitutional monarchy. This was the establishment welcoming him fully into its centre, and Hugo accepted the welcome. He gave speeches on social questions. He advocated against the death penalty. He raised the condition of the poor as a parliamentary matter in terms that his colleagues found admirable and also slightly uncomfortable. But he was sitting in the chamber of the privileged while doing it, and the gap between his growing identification with the dispossessed and his actual social position was one that he had not yet been forced to resolve. He accepted a seat in the peerage from a king he was beginning to privately question. The man who would one day call himself the voice of the people was, for the moment, sitting comfortably in the chamber of the privileged. That comfort would not last, and the event that would end it was already approaching from a direction he could not have anticipated. On the 4th of September 1843, Victor Hugo was sitting in a café in Rochefort in southwestern France. He was travelling with Juliette Drouet. It was late morning. He ordered something, perhaps coffee, and picked up a newspaper. He was not reading it carefully. He was glancing through it, the way people glance at newspapers when they are between things. And then he saw a name. Léopoldine, his eldest daughter, 19 years old, married only 6 months earlier to Charles Vacquerie, a young man from a good family, in a ceremony that Hugo had attended with the complicated emotional mixture of a father who loves his daughter and does not fully want to release her. She had been happy. The marriage had seemed right. Villequier, where they were living, was a small town on the Seine in Normandy. The newspaper told him the rest. On the 4th of September, Léopoldine and Charles had gone out on the Seine in a small boat. The boat overturned in the current. Charles had pulled her to safety on a sandbank, but the Seine in that stretch was treacherous and the current strong. The boat overturned again. Charles's uncle, who had been with them, drowned. Then Charles. Then Léopoldine. She had gone into the water and not come out. Hugo read this in a café in Rochefort from a stranger's newspaper, not from a letter, not from a messenger who had found him on the road, from a newspaper, her name in print, her death reported in the same column of text as other things that had happened that week. The journey back was slow. Travel in 1843 required days, not hours, and Hugo made the journey toward a reality he could not yet fully hold in his mind. Léopoldine was buried before he arrived. He stood at the grave in Villequier on a hillside above the river that had taken her, and looked at the earth, and said whatever a father says to a grave that will not answer. What happened inside Hugo after this moment is not something the historical record can fully open. He did not write about it publicly for years. He did not speak about it publicly for years. The grief went somewhere inside him and did not emerge in any form his readers could see until the publication of Les Contemplations 13 years later. But the grief shaped everything that followed. It shaped his political radicalization. The man who had accepted a peerage and written poetry for comfortable audiences began, in the years after Léopoldine's death, to think differently about what he owed the world, about what literature was for, about whether the comfortable position he occupied was the right one for a man who had now been personally introduced to the experience of losing everything in an instant, with no warning, from a cause entirely outside his control. It shaped Les Misérables, the novel he had been assembling in notes and fragments since the early 1840s, existed before her death, but the novel he finally completed and published in exile 18 years later was different from the book those early notes had been pointing toward. It was denser with feeling, more committed to the proposition that suffering does not ennoble people from a safe theoretical distance, but breaks them open in ways that require another person to recognize, to witness, to refuse to look away from. Hugo understood that from the inside now. He had been broken open in a café in Rochefort on a September morning, and unlike his fictional characters, no one had been there to witness it. He had written about suffering all his life. He had described it, honored it, shaped it into language that moved people to tears. And now it had come for him, not dramatically, not with the grandeur that his novels gave to tragedy. It came in small print, in a stranger's newspaper, at a café table in Rochefort, while his coffee went cold. For nearly a decade after Léopoldine's death, Hugo published almost nothing that bore the weight of what had happened. This was not creative paralysis. He was writing privately, urgently, and with a directness that would not appear in his published work for 13 more years. The elegies he composed for his daughter in the years immediately following her death were among the most honest writing of his life. Poems that did not reach for grandeur or consolation. Poems that simply sat in the presence of an absence and tried to describe what that presence had been. He kept them to himself, in the chest at Hauteville House where he stored manuscripts, in the journals that his family and literary executors would eventually find unsettling in various ways. He had learned, perhaps, that the most sincere grief is also the most private, or perhaps he understood that publishing it would transform it into something public, something that could be received and appreciated and reviewed, and he was not ready for his daughter to become a literary event. His public life continued. He entered the Chamber of Peers. He gave speeches. He opposed capital punishment in language that caused genuine discomfort in the chamber. He watched French politics with increasing unease as Louis Philippe's government grew more conservative and the distance between its promises and its practice widened. In 1845, he was caught in a minor but uncomfortable public scandal, found with a woman, not his wife, in circumstances that required some journalistic attention. The incident was managed. It disappeared from public discussion relatively quickly, but it illustrated something about the pattern of his life in these years: the grief going in, the appetite continuing outward, the inner life increasingly partitioned from the public performance. He was also, in these years, beginning to accumulate the observations, the research, the encounters with the French prison system and the lives of the French poor that would eventually become the structural material of Les Misérables. He visited prisons, he documented cases, he watched how the law moved through human lives, which people it protected and which it consumed. The future novel was assembling itself, slowly, in the background of a life that showed no outward sign of what was being prepared. He kept the poems about Léopoldine for 13 years. For 13 years, the most celebrated writer in France held the most honest writing he had ever done in a private space, as though releasing it would finalize something he was not ready to finalize. And all around the silence, the public man continued to perform his public life with unfailing confidence, with the certainty that he had something to say that the world needed to hear. That certainty was, in its way, protective. You do not survive the kind of loss Hugo had survived by releasing your grip on your sense of purpose, but it was also, in its way, a continuation of the distance that had always existed between Victor Hugo and the people who needed something from him that the public performance could not provide. The most celebrated writer in France was sitting alone with his daughter's name on pages that no one was allowed to read, and something in him was changing, slowly, in ways that would not be fully visible for years. An event was approaching that would force every question into the open. On the 2nd of December 1851, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte dissolved the National Assembly by force and declared himself ruler of France. Hugo had seen it coming and had said so, loudly and specifically, in the chamber and in public. Louis Napoleon had been elected president of the Second Republic in 1848, in the aftermath of yet another revolution that had toppled Louis Philippe. Hugo had initially given him a qualified and wary support. Within months, he had withdrawn it entirely. He had watched Louis Napoleon accumulate power incrementally, undermine republican institutions carefully, and position himself for exactly what he now executed. When the coup happened, Hugo did not retreat to his study. He went into the streets. He walked through Paris in the days after the 2nd of December, physically moving through the resistance that was organizing in working-class neighborhoods. He signed declarations. He appeared at barricades. He moved between groups of resistors in a city, filling rapidly with soldiers loyal to the new government. It was genuine physical courage from a man whose political positions had sometimes been easier to hold in a comfortable chamber than in the open street. The resistance collapsed within days. The French army was loyal to Louis Napoleon, and the people of Paris, exhausted by years of political upheaval, did not rise in the numbers that might have turned things differently. Louis Napoleon consolidated his power and within a year declared himself Emperor Napoleon III. Hugo had a price on his head. He fled, first to Brussels, where he spent several months and began writing his furious political pamphlet against the new emperor, then to the island of Jersey in the English Channel, then, in 1855, expelled from Jersey after one of his sons published political material that offended the island's government. He moved to Guernsey, to a tall, narrow house on a hillside above the harbour of St. Peter Port. He would remain there for nearly 14 years. The exile began as a political statement and a genuine necessity. Hugo announced publicly that he would not return to France until liberty returned. Napoleon III's government offered him amnesties. Hugo refused them all, with a public dignity that enhanced his reputation considerably and must also have satisfied something in him that went beyond political principle. He was the great man in exile. He was the conscience of France, burning steadily from a small island, while the country he loved was governed by a man he despised. But exile is also isolation, and isolation, for a man of Hugo's temperament and appetite, was never purely romantic. He was cut off from the literary world of Paris. He was cut off from the political arena where he had been most alive. He had Juliet near him, in a smaller house on the same road. He had his sons Charles and François Victor, who had followed him into exile. He had Adele, his wife, who had come with the family. And he had the sea. Every day from Guernsey he could look out at the water. The English Channel, which was the same water that fed the Seine, the same water that had claimed Léopoldine. He built a glass-enclosed room at the top of Hauteville House, the highest point of the building, and he stood there every morning and worked, looking out at the horizon that separated him from the France he had decided to save, wondering, perhaps, whether France needed saving from itself or from men like him. He had walked through the barricades with a pistol, certain that France would rise. France did not rise, and Victor Hugo found himself on a cold island in the English Channel, watching the sea, carrying a grief he had still not fully released to the world, and beginning, finally, to write the novel he had been building toward for 20 years. Hauteville House still stands on a hillside above the harbour of St. Peter Port in Guernsey. You can visit it today. It is open to the public, maintained by the city of Paris, and it remains one of the strangest and most revealing buildings in French literary history. Hugo bought it in 1856 with the proceeds from his writing, a tall, narrow, slightly awkward structure on a quiet street. From the outside it looks like any other prosperous Victorian townhouse on a prosperous Channel Island street. You would not necessarily stop to look at it twice. Then you go inside. Hugo decorated every room himself. Every room. He did not hire an interior designer or consult an architect about aesthetics. He spent years carving wood, selecting fabrics, arranging objects, inscribing quotations into walls and ceilings and door frames. The ground floor dining room is panelled entirely in dark carved oak, with a massive fireplace and a quality of compressed, deliberate richness that feels less like a room in a house and more like a stage set for a particular kind of drama. The upper floors became progressively more elaborate, more dense with meaning, more explicitly personal. And at the very top, a glass-enclosed room he called the Crystal Room. 4 walls of glass, facing the sea in almost every direction, a high desk at which he stood to write, because he believed that standing improved his concentration, a view that on clear days extended all the way to the coast of France, just visible on the horizon. He stood there every morning, he worked there every morning, and he looked at the sea. This matters beyond the biographical detail. The house was a world Hugo built entirely according to his own vision, controlled in ways that the actual world had consistently refused to be controlled. His political world had expelled him. His domestic world had quietly reorganized itself around absence and compromise. His literary world, for all its celebrations, was always subject to the judgment of readers and critics he could not fully direct. The house was not subject to anyone's judgment but his. Every inscription, every carved panel, every arrangement of objects said something that Hugo had chosen to say. The house was, in this sense, the most honest self-portrait he produced during the exile years. Not a novel, not a collection of poems, but a physical space whose every element had been selected by a man who needed, very badly, to be the sole author of his environment. There are other things the house reveals. The obsessive quality of the decoration suggests a mind that does not rest easily. that needs to fill available surfaces with meaning in the way that some people need to fill available silence with words. The sheer accumulation of it, the carved mottos, the symbolic arrangements, the theatrical darkness of the lower rooms, all of it points toward a man who experienced emptiness as a threat to be countered rather than a condition to be inhabited. And then there is the crystal room. Every morning, standing at his high desk, looking south across the water. Whether he thought about Leopoldine at those moments is not something the record documents. Whether the choice of a glass room facing the sea, on an island surrounded by the same water that had taken her, was conscious or instinctive, is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. But every morning he stood there and looked at it, the sea that was also the Seine, the water that gave him his exile and had taken his daughter, and he wrote. The first notes toward what became Les Misérables date to 1845. Hugo had begun sketching a story about a convict released from prison who attempts to rebuild his life in a society determined to define him forever by what he had done. He had a title, Les Misères, the Wretched. He worked on it intensively for 2 years, then set it aside when the political upheavals of 1848 consumed his attention. What he returned to in Guernsey was a different book, not different in its basic architecture. Jean Valjean remained a convict. The bishop who extended him grace remained the pivot on which the early narrative turned. The relentless pursuit by Inspector Javert remained the engine of the plot. But the emotional weight of the material had changed in ways that are perceptible to any careful reader, and that Hugo himself, in his notebooks, acknowledged without quite naming their source. The man who resumed work on Les Misérables in exile was a man who had been broken open by a loss that had never been publicly accounted for. Leopoldine's death had not made Hugo religious in any conventional sense, but it had given him a specific, personal understanding of what it felt like to be at the mercy of forces that had no interest in individual human worth. The Seine did not know Leopoldine was his daughter. The current did not adjust itself to spare someone good and young and loved. The universe, in the experience of that September morning, had been indifferent in the most absolute sense. Jean Valjean lives in a world with exactly that quality. A world where the law is indifferent to individual humanity, where the sentence that destroyed 19 years of a man's life was given for stealing bread to feed a starving child, where the system that was supposed to protect the weak, instead, marked the weak permanently and called the marking justice. Hugo understood that from the inside now. He also brought to the book a documentary seriousness about French poverty and the French penal system that went beyond literary imagination. He had been gathering material for years. He had visited prisons in the 1830s and 40s. He had witnessed public executions and written against them. He had documented in his notebooks the lives of people he encountered in the streets of Paris who existed in conditions that the comfortable members of the French legislature preferred not to examine. The novel absorbed all of it. The Battle of Waterloo, reconstructed in the famous digression that readers sometimes find excessive and that Hugo found essential, because he wanted his readers to understand the world that had produced Valjean's France. The sewers of Paris, mapped in astonishing detail in a section that required Hugo to research the actual underground infrastructure of the city. The history of the French Revolutionary period, woven through the character of the student Republican Enjolras and the doomed uprising of June 1832. The scale of the book was not accidental or undisciplined. It was a deliberate argument that individual human suffering cannot be understood without understanding the full structure of the society that produces it. You cannot understand Jean Valjean's stolen loaf of bread without understanding the France that drove him to steal it. Hugo finished the novel in Guernsey in 1861. He wrote the final pages in a house called Saintonge, on the island of Mont Saint-Michel, where he had gone to get distance from Hauteville House and the presence of his household. He wrote the last section of the book, The Death of Jean Valjean, and then he sat for a moment in the quiet of the room, and then he wrote to his publisher. The book was published in April and May of 1862 in installments. It sold out on the first day in Paris. The queues at the booksellers were compared, in newspaper accounts, to queues for bread, which was the comparison Hugo would have chosen himself. He had spent 15 years preparing to write a novel about what it cost to be forgiven. He had spent 15 years learning, privately, what it felt like to need it. Whether he ever fully connected those two things, whether the accounting was ever complete, is the question his notebooks never quite answer directly. Les Misérables is not, at its core, a novel about the French underclass, though it contains the most vivid and historically grounded portrait of French poverty in 19th-century literature. It is a novel about the relationship between law and conscience, and that distinction is everything. Hugo's central opposition is precise. On one side, Inspector Javert, a man who has organized his entire inner life around the conviction that the law is justice, that what the law permits is right, and what it prohibits is wrong, and that the function of moral human beings is to enforce this alignment without sympathy or exception. Javert is not a villain in any simple sense. He is a man of genuine conviction, total consistency, and absolute inner coherence. He believes what he believes with a purity that his world provides almost no opportunity to challenge, until Valjean. Because Valjean, the escaped convict who has rebuilt himself into a man of extraordinary decency, is both a criminal under Javert's law and, by any humane measure, proof that the law's categories are insufficient. He is simultaneously the worst thing Javert's system can produce and the best thing a human being can become. And Javert cannot hold both facts simultaneously. His entire interior structure has no room for the contradiction. Hugo understood what he was arguing. He was arguing that conscience supersedes law, that a justice system which cannot recognize the transformation of a human being is not administering justice. It is administering something colder and more mechanical, something that uses the language of justice while being structurally indifferent to the human realities that justice is supposed to address. This was not an abstract philosophical position for Hugo in 1862. He had watched the French legal system operate for decades. He had documented specific cases. He had spoken against the death penalty in the Chamber of Peers, using examples drawn from actual judicial proceedings. He knew the distance between what the law called justice and what justice actually required. The character of Fantine stands alongside Valjean as the novel's most devastating moral exhibit. A young woman, abandoned by the man who fathered her child, forced to sell first her hair, then her teeth, then her body, in a sequence of degradations that the novel presents without sensationalism and without condescension, which makes it considerably harder to look away from than outrage or pity alone would allow. Fantine is not destroyed by her own choices. She is destroyed by the absence of any social structure capable of supporting a woman in her circumstances. The system that condemns her has provided her with no alternative. Hugo's argument, stated in the preface he wrote for the novel, was deliberately direct. He said, "As long as ignorance and poverty exist on earth, books like this one are not without purpose." He was not speaking modestly. He was announcing that the book was a political act, that its intention was not merely to move readers, but to change the conditions it described. The immediate response suggested the argument was heard. The novel generated debates across Europe about criminal justice reform, about poverty, about what obligations a society carries toward its most vulnerable members. In France, politicians quoted it. In England, critics reviewed it with a seriousness usually reserved for philosophical treatises. In the United States, The novel circulated widely during the Civil War, and soldiers on both sides were reported to have been reading it in camps. He had written the most persuasive argument for human mercy in the French language and given it to the world. And in the same years he was writing it, he was conducting himself in ways that the novel's central character would not have recognized as grace. Whether Hugo noticed that gap, whether he chose not to notice it, is a different question entirely, and one the novel itself cannot answer. There is a version of Victor Hugo that the public monument was constructed to display, and then there is the version that emerges from the private record. They are not entirely different people, but they are not the same person either. Hugo wrote constantly, and not just the published work. He kept journals, commonplace books, records of conversations and observations, drafts of speeches, notes toward essays. The collection known as Choses Vues, Things Seen, drawn from these records and published posthumously, is one of the great documents of 19th-century French life. It covers decades, ranging across politics, literature, poverty, celebrity, death, crime, and ordinary human observation, with a clarity and intelligence that makes it one of the most readable things Hugo ever produced. It also reveals a man who was watching the world with great precision while maintaining certain strategic blind spots about himself. The more private journals, the ones that his family and literary executors handled with considerable discretion in the years after his death, document something that became increasingly difficult to ignore across the course of the 20th century, as Hugo's scholarship became more rigorous and more willing to look directly at the material. Hugo was compulsively, persistently, and quite unself-consciously unfaithful, not casually, not occasionally, with a regularity and a variety that he documented in his notebooks with a frankness that reads, depending on your temperament, as either admirably honest or remarkably unreflective. He recorded encounters, he recorded names, he recorded his own responses with the same observational attentiveness he brought to everything else he watched. The notebooks do not read like the confessions of a man wrestling with his own behavior. They read like the notes of a man who found his own behavior interesting in the way he found all human behavior interesting, as material, as evidence of something, as part of the great record he was keeping of what it meant to be alive in his time. This is, in its way, its own kind of revelation. A man who wrongs other people and knows it, who feels guilt, who tries to do differently and fails, is a familiar moral figure. We have language for that person. What Hugo's notebooks suggest is something slightly different. A man whose relationship to his own conduct was primarily descriptive rather than evaluative. He did not, in the private record, condemn himself or excuse himself at any significant length. He recorded, he moved on, he wrote the next poem, the next chapter, the next speech about the dignity of the poor. Juliet knew. She said so in letters that are still available to read. She named what was happening with the kind of directness that comes from a person who has decided that clarity is more bearable than the particular cruelty of pretending not to know. Hugo responded to her directness when he responded to it with tenderness and with the implicit assurance that the relationship between them was real regardless of his conduct elsewhere, which was true and also insufficient. The poet who understood suffering in its most abstract and most sweeping dimensions kept his private notebooks with the detachment of a scientist recording field observations. He noticed everything about the human world around him. He noticed almost nothing about the effect of his own behavior on the specific humans who were closest to him. The notebooks were a confession that never quite became an accounting, and yet they are among the most valuable documents in Hugo's archive because they show us the man whole, not the monument, not the prophet, not the exile, just the man, looking at his own life with the same interested, slightly remote attention he gave to everything else. In 1856, 4 years into his Guernsey exile, Victor Hugo published the collection that many French critics still consider the pinnacle of his poetic achievement. Les Contemplations is organized into 2 halves, each with a title. The first half is called Autrefois, meaning formerly. The second is called Aujourd'hui, meaning today. Between them, Hugo placed a single date, the 4th of September 1843, her date. Everything in the first half of the book belongs to the world before that morning in Rochefort. Poems of joy, of nature, of love, of creative excitement, of the pleasures of being alive and young, and certain that the future holds good things. They are not naive poems. Hugo was technically too accomplished for naivety, but they have a quality of groundedness, of trust in the continuity of experience, that the second half of the book has lost entirely. The second half opens with grief and does not recover from it, not in the sense of failing to resolve, in the sense of choosing not to resolve, of insisting that some losses do not resolve, that the correct response to certain absences is not consolation, but an honest refusal of consolation. The most celebrated of the Leopoldine elegies is a poem known by its opening line, Demain, dès l'aube, meaning tomorrow, at dawn. In it, Hugo addresses his daughter directly, describing a journey he will make to her grave. He tells her he will walk through the forest, through the hills, without seeing anything around him, without hearing anything, because his grief is total. He will arrive at her grave, and he will lay on it what he has brought, a spray of holly and heather in flower, and then the poem ends. Not with consolation, not with the promise of reunion, with a grave and 2 small plants and the silence after. 13 years he had held that poem. 13 years it had waited in a chest at Hauteville House, while he moved through political upheaval and exile, and the accumulation of public celebrity. And when he finally released it, along with the other elegies, along with the full architecture of the collection, France received it with a shock of recognition that is very rarely available in literary culture. The book sold out. Readers wept publicly. Critics who had sometimes found Hugo's work overpowering in its scale found in Les Contemplations something that felt genuinely intimate, genuinely wounded, genuinely human, in a way that his more monumental productions had approached but not quite achieved. He had kept them for 13 years. He had carried them through everything, and when he finally gave them to the world, France understood in a way it had not understood before what lay beneath the public figure. What France did not know, and could not know from the poems alone, was how the 13 years between the loss and the publication had actually been lived. The poems created an impression of a man enclosed by grief, defined by it, made solitary by it. The biographical record is considerably more complicated than that impression. The poems were true, and the life around them was also true. Both things existed simultaneously in the same man. That coexistence, more than any individual fact about Hugo's private conduct, is the thing that resists simple explanation. 2 months after the coup of December 1851, while still in Brussels and not yet settled in Guernsey, Hugo published a pamphlet. He called it Napoleon the Little. The title was designed to wound. The Napoleon the world knew was the first one, the emperor who had remapped Europe, the figure whose shadow still lay across everything France understood about itself. The man who had just seized power in Paris was his nephew. Napoleon the Little was Hugo's argument that the imperial name was being used to dress up something considerably smaller than its claimant believed it to be. A small ambition in a large costume. A theft disguised as a destiny. The pamphlet was banned in France immediately. It circulated everywhere else. Hugo sent copies into France through networks of sympathizers who moved them across the border in luggage and beneath clothing and in false-bottomed crates. It reached readers who were not supposed to have access to it, which is always the most effective form of distribution for a political document. Being forbidden gave it an authority that simple publication would not have provided. The following year came the poems. Les Châtiments, The Punishments, published in Brussels in 1853, was the most sustained piece of political invective in French verse. Hugo attacked the Second Empire and its emperor poem after poem, with a range of weapons: satire, elegy, historical comparison, direct denunciation, visionary prophecy. The collection was not simply angry, it was architecturally constructed, organized so that the emotional temperature rose and fell in ways that made sustained reading possible without the repetition of a single note diminishing the effect. The empire banned it. The empire could not stop it. Copies entered France in the same way Napoleon the Little had entered, and they found readers who were hungry for exactly this quality of articulate, fearless opposition. Hugo understood what he was doing. He had chosen the role of the prophet in exile, and he played it with full commitment. The refusals of amnesty were not merely principle, they were strategy. Every time Napoleon III offered him a way back to France, and Hugo declined, the declination reinforced the narrative. The great writer standing alone against illegitimate power, the conscience of France refusing to be bought or pardoned into silence. This was genuine courage. The empire was not incapable of harming people who opposed it, and Hugo's distance from France did not make him entirely safe. The courage was real. But it would be a simplification to pretend that the exile served only Hugo's principles. It also served his image. The man who returned to France in 1870 was far more than the celebrated writer who had left in 1851. He was a figure of mythological dimensions. He was the man who had refused Napoleon's pardons and held the Republican flame through 19 years of political darkness. The exile had made him more famous than anything he could have achieved by staying in Paris and navigating the complexities of life under a government he despised. Both things were true simultaneously. The principle was real, the advantage was real, and Hugo, who was always simultaneously more honest and more self-interested than his admirers preferred to acknowledge, knew it. He had refused every offer of amnesty. He said it was for liberty. It was also, at least in part, because the exile had positioned him in ways that any comfortable return to Paris would have quietly dismantled. Victor Hugo published his first major poetry collection in 1822. He published the final installment of his most ambitious poetic project in 1883. That is 61 years of continuous poetic production, from a young man trying to impress the Académie Française to an old man attempting nothing less than a verse history of the entire human race. Most people who know Les Misérables do not know La Légende des siècles. The Legend of the Centuries, published in 3 installments in 1859, 1877, and 1883, is the work in which Hugo's most extreme literary ambition found its fullest expression. It is a sequence of epic poems, organized not chronologically but visionally, moving through human history from creation to a speculative future, selecting moments that illuminate what Hugo believed was the long, slow, incomplete, but genuine moral progress of civilization. Adam and Eve, the Cid, the Crusades, the Inquisition, the Age of Exploration, the French Revolution. Hugo moved through these with the assumption that a poet of sufficient reach could hold all of human time in a single extended meditation, and find, within the chaos and the suffering and the recurring failure of human goodness, a direction, not a guarantee, not a promise, a direction. The ambition was staggering, the achievement was uneven, as it was bound to be, because no single poetic mind can sustain that level of historical and imaginative engagement across 60 years without producing work of radically different quality at different moments. But at its best, La Légende des siècles, contains some of the most powerful verse in the French language. The section called Booz endormi, Boaz asleep, a meditation on the Book of Ruth, is widely considered among the finest French poems of the 19th century, a piece of sustained lyrical beauty that operates at a level where theological and erotic feeling become indistinguishable from each other. Hugo's other poetic works from the exile and post-exile years include La fin de Satan, The End of Satan, and Dieu, God, both of which he left unfinished and which were published posthumously. These were theological meditations on a scale that has few precedents in French literature. Hugo was not writing religious poetry in any orthodox sense. He had his own theology, one that combined a belief in a divine creative force with a deep suspicion of organized religion and a conviction that the movement of history was itself a form of moral education being administered to the human species. He saw himself as a prophet in a fairly literal sense, not a prophet who delivered divine messages, but a prophet in the Old Testament tradition of the poet who sees further than his contemporaries and whose obligation is to say what he sees, regardless of whether his contemporaries are ready to hear it. This self-conception is part of what made him so effective as a public figure and so difficult as a private one. A prophet is not, by temperament or definition, a person primarily concerned with the feelings of the individuals immediately around him. A prophet is concerned with the species, with the long arc, with what the permanent record will say. He was writing the history of humanity from creation to some future he could imagine but not live to see. It was the most grandiose literary project in French history. It was also, perhaps, the ultimate expression of a sensibility that found it considerably easier to understand all of humanity in the abstract than to understand the particular people in the next room. There are two Adèles in Victor Hugo's life, and both of them, by the end, had been undone by their proximity to him. The elder Adèle, his wife, had spent decades maintaining the formal structure of a marriage that had ceased to be a marriage in any meaningful sense. She lived where Hugo lived, travelled when the exile required travel, appeared at the events that required the appearance of a family. She was not publicly humiliated. She was not publicly abandoned. She was publicly maintained in the role of wife, which is a different kind of condition, and in some ways, a lonelier one. She died on the 27th of August 1868 in Brussels, where the family was staying at the time. Hugo was with her. He mourned her. The obituaries were respectful and warm. She had been, by every public account, the devoted companion of France's greatest writer. What the obituaries did not say, and what Hugo did not say, was that the 46 years of their formal marriage had been organized primarily around his needs. The early devotion had been real. What followed the early years had been a series of accommodations that required Adèle to accommodate rather than Hugo. The younger Adèle, their youngest child, born in 1830, carried a different kind of story into a different kind of darkness. She had grown up in the shadow of a father who was always the most important person in every room and who had directed more of his emotional attention toward his writing than toward the specific needs of his children. She was sensitive, intensely so, and she became fixated in the early 1860s on a British military officer named Albert Pinson. The fixation was not reciprocated in any serious way. Pinson was stationed in various locations, and Adèle followed him, first to Halifax in Canada, where she lived for years under a false name, writing increasingly strange letters to her family, insisting that Pinson and she were secretly married. Then to Barbados, when Pinson's regiment was posted there. She was found in Barbados in 1872, wandering in a state that contemporary accounts describe with the circumlocutions of their period, but that modern reading recognizes as a full mental collapse. She was brought back to France and placed in a private asylum in Saint-Mandé, near Paris, where she lived until her death in 1915. She outlived her father by 30 years. Hugo buried his wife in Brussels in 1868 with full public honours. He visited his younger daughter. He was not indifferent to what had happened to her. But there is a quality to the biographical record of his response to both women that the word present does not quite capture. He was physically present. He cared in the way that a man cares when he has not actually registered, at any deep level, what his presence or absence has cost the people around him. He buried his wife with the appropriate public honours. He mourned publicly. What he did not say, and what the obituaries could not say, was that the domestic life behind the public marriage had required Adele to disappear into it, and that her youngest daughter had, in a different way, disappeared entirely. On the 5th of September 1870, Victor Hugo arrived at the Gare du Nord in Paris. The Franco-Prussian War had ended the Second Empire. Napoleon III had been captured at the Battle of Sedan. The Third Republic had been proclaimed, and the exile was over. The crowds at the station were extraordinary. People had been gathering for hours before the train arrived. When Hugo stepped onto the platform, the noise was immediate and sustained, the kind of sound that, once you have heard accounts of it, becomes difficult to imagine as anything other than what it was, an entire city releasing something it had been holding for 19 years. He was 68 years old. He had left as the conscience of France in exile. He returned as the nearest thing to a living national monument that any democratic republic had produced. He was elected to the National Assembly within months. Then, in 1876, to the Senate. He gave speeches. He continued to write. The publications kept coming. La Légende des siècles was still appearing in installments, new poetry collections, new political essays. He was, by any measurement, as productive in his 7th decade as most writers are in their 3rd. But the France he returned to was not the France he had left, and the return was more complicated than the crowds at the Gare du Nord suggested. The Franco-Prussian War had been a catastrophe. Paris had been besieged for months. Prussian forces had stood on French soil within sight of Versailles. The Treaty of Frankfurt that ended the war required France to cede Alsace and Lorraine and pay a punishing indemnity. The country was humiliated in a way that would not be fully reckoned with for another generation. And before the war had fully concluded, the Paris Commune had happened. A radical popular government had seized control of the city for 72 days before being suppressed by the French army, with a violence that produced somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 dead Parisians in a single week of street fighting. The exact number has never been established. The scale was sufficient that French political life would not recover its equilibrium for a decade. Hugo had been in Brussels during the Commune's final suppression, watching from the border. He had offered shelter to Commune refugees, which cost him his welcome in Belgium and forced a temporary move to Luxembourg. It was the kind of act, generous, immediately expensive, politically inconvenient, that showed Hugo at his most genuinely decent. He was 70 years old when the street of Paris filled with people shouting his name. He had waited 19 years for that moment. And standing there, in the carriage, looking at the crowd, something in him must have understood that this was exactly the thing he had wanted more than almost anything else his life had produced, more than domestic peace, more than resolution, more than the things his private life had never quite managed to provide. The prophet had returned, and the question that the crowd could not have heard, that even Hugo may not have asked himself directly, was what exactly a prophet does when the wilderness is over and the city is waiting. The Paris Commune of 1871 lasted 72 days and ended in what the French called La Semaine Sanglante, the Bloody Week, during which the army of the Versailles government retook the city street by street. When it was over, the reprisals were systematic and severe. Mass trials, mass deportations to New Caledonia in the Pacific, Summary executions. The exact number killed will never be precisely known, but estimates place the dead at a minimum of 10,000 and possibly twice that. The Commune's politics had been radical, and its methods had included genuine atrocities, including the execution of hostages and the burning of several significant Parisian buildings. Hugo's response to the Commune itself had been complicated. He had not supported it. He had been uncomfortable with its methods and skeptical of its leadership. He had spent those 72 days watching from a distance with the same troubled attention he had given to every French political upheaval of the past 40 years. But when the reprisals came, when the tribunals began processing communards by the thousand and the deportation ships began filling, Hugo took a position that cost him considerably. He publicly advocated amnesty, not for the leadership, not for those directly responsible for specific atrocities, for the rank and file, for the workers and the young men and the desperate people who had joined the Commune out of poverty and genuine grievance rather than ideological commitment or personal violence. He argued, in speeches and in print, that a France genuinely committed to republican values could not respond to insurrection by turning its courts into instruments of mass revenge. Both sides condemned him for it. The right considered him a Commune sympathizer. The Commune's surviving supporters felt his advocacy was too limited, too qualified, too careful about distinguishing between those he was willing to defend and those he was not. He was attacked in newspapers that had celebrated him 18 months earlier. He received threatening letters. He maintained the position. This is Hugo operating with a moral clarity that goes beyond rhetoric. It is easy to advocate mercy for the suffering in the abstract, in a novel, in a poem composed at a safe distance from the event being described. It is considerably harder to advocate mercy for specific, politically toxic, socially condemned people at a moment when doing so carries real personal cost. Hugo had written about that distinction his entire life, the difference between comfortable compassion and the kind that requires something from you. In the aftermath of the Commune, he demonstrated that he understood the distinction from the inside. He had written his whole life about the forgotten and the condemned. Now the condemned were standing in front of him, real, present, and politically dangerous to defend. He defended them anyway, and it cost him considerably. It was, by the evidence of the record, one of the most genuinely honest things he ever did, not because it confirmed what his novels argued, but because it revealed that at least some of what his novels argued had actually taken root in the man who wrote them. Juliette Drouet died on the 11th of May 1883 in the apartment she had shared in recent years with Hugo in Paris. She was 76 years old. She had been ill for several months, a stomach cancer that progressed with the particular cruelty of illnesses that allow enough lucidity for the person dying to know exactly what is happening. Hugo was with her through the illness. He visited daily. He sat with her. The man who had spent 50 years maintaining a certain emotional distance, who had received her devotion with a consistency that suggests he came to regard it as simply the texture of his life, was present at the end in ways that suggested he understood, at last, or perhaps at last admitted, what he was losing. She had written him a letter on New Year's Day 1883, 4 months before she died. It was one of the last letters she wrote him with full physical ease. She told him that she had loved him for 50 years, that the 50 years had been her life in its most essential sense, that she wanted nothing more than she had been given, which was not quite true, but which was the kind of generous simplification that a dying person sometimes offers to the living, to spare them the full accounting. Hugo kept the letter. After her death, people who knew him described a change in his quality, not a dramatic collapse. He continued to appear in public. He continued to write. The final installment of La Légende des siècles was published that same year, 1883, as though the creative machinery was running on its own momentum, regardless of what the man powering it was experiencing. But something had gone quiet. The people closest to him in his final 2 years described a man who seemed, for the first time, to have lost the sense of orientation that had always characterized him, not confused, not diminished intellectually, but somehow less anchored. As though a weight he had not recognized as weight, because it had been so constant for so long, had been removed, and the absence was revealing something he had no previous experience of feeling. He had written about the death of the beloved for decades. He had given that particular grief to his characters with a vividness and a precision that suggested intimate knowledge. But the knowledge had always been mediated through the act of writing itself, transformed by craft, held at the distance that craft provides. Now there was simply the fact, the apartment without her, the silence where 50 years of letters had been, the absence of the person who had, whatever else was true about the relationship, been the constant human fact of his adult life. Juliette Drouet had loved Victor Hugo for 50 years with a completeness and a steadiness that he had never fully matched and had never fully relinquished. He had accepted it as his due, or so the record suggests, for most of those years. And when it ended, in the quiet of an apartment in Paris in the spring of 1883, the man who had spent a lifetime giving voice to other people's grief found himself, for the first time, with no page to put his own grief on. Hugo's last novel of significant consequence was Quatre-Vingt-Treize, published in 1874, 4 years after his return from exile. The title refers to the year 1793, the height of the Terror, when the French Revolution consumed many of the people who had made it. It is a novel about civil war within civil war, about the conflict inside the conflict, about the impossible moral positions that political extremity creates for individuals who still believe in something more than the faction they belong to. It was well received. It is still read in France as part of the standard Hugo canon, but even critics at the time recognized something in it that was slightly different from the best of his earlier work, a quality of deliberateness, a sense of a writer working from accumulated principle rather than from the kind of urgency that had driven Les Misérables and Notre-Dame de Paris. The argument was still sharp, the set pieces were still vivid, but the emotional temperature was cooler than expected. The third installment of La Légende des siècles, in 1883, was the last significant literary event of his life. He was 81 years old when it appeared. The ambition remained intact, the scope unchanged, the commitment to the prophetic project of his life undiminished in conception, if somewhat reduced in sustained creative energy. The French literary world around him had changed in ways that were not exactly unkind to Hugo, but that were quietly leaving him in a different category than the one he occupied. The naturalist movement, associated above all with Émile Zola, was the dominant force in French fiction by the 1870s and 80s. Where Hugo had worked with the full moral sweep of Romanticism, the confidence that literature could and should assert what was right and wrong about the world, naturalism moved toward documentation, toward the accumulation of social and physiological detail, toward a deterministic view of human nature that found the grand moral arc of a Valjean not so much wrong as methodologically suspect. Hugo and Zola respected each other cautiously. They were never enemies, but they represented genuinely different understandings of what fiction was for, and it was Zola's understanding that was gaining ground with younger writers and younger readers. This was not failure. Hugo was still celebrated everywhere he went. Streets and schools and public buildings bore his name while he was alive to see them. He sat in the Senate. He received delegations. When he appeared in public, people stopped. But the literary world he had dominated for 50 years was gently, respectfully, moving on without him. He was celebrated everywhere. He was also, gradually, becoming a monument rather than a living force. And those two things, though they look similar from the outside, feel very different from the inside. In his final 2 years, Hugo was frequently surrounded and frequently alone in the way that very old and very celebrated people sometimes are. People came to him, journalists, admirers, political figures, former colleagues, young writers who wanted to be able to say they had been in the room with him. He received them. He spoke. He was, by all accounts, still mentally present in ways that impressed those who had expected diminishment. But there is a quality to the biographical record of these final 2 years that is difficult to name precisely. A stillness that is not peace, an absence at the center of the continuous public activity. The letters from this period are fewer than from earlier decades. The notebooks thin. The private record, which had always been the most revealing evidence of what Hugo was actually experiencing, becomes less dense, as though the habit of self-documentation was itself losing momentum. He had spent a lifetime organizing his interior life primarily around his creative ambitions and his public role. The relationship between those two organizing forces and the people who had loved him, who had built their lives in proximity to his and paid the costs that proximity carried, had never been a relationship Hugo examined at any sustained depth in the private record. He had examined everything else. He had examined French history and the nature of the law and the mechanisms of poverty and the theology of progress. He had examined his own grief when Léopoldine died with an honesty that produced some of the finest elegies in French literature. But the gap between the man he wrote and the man he was, the distance between Jean Valjean's agonizing, costly, beautiful movement toward grace and Victor Hugo's comfortable acceptance of the grace that other people extended to him, that gap was one he appears to have crossed deliberately in his fiction and bypassed equally deliberately in his self-examination. Whether this was unconscious, a blind spot so fundamental that he genuinely could not see it, or strategic, the instinct of a man who understood that certain questions, honestly answered, would have required him to live differently, is something the record cannot finally resolve. What the record does show is a man who, in his final years, had received everything he had set out to receive: the immortality he had wanted at 15, the public position he had built across 7 decades, the 2 million mourners who were already, in some sense, waiting for him, and who sat in his apartment in Paris, in the winter of 1884 and 1885, in the quiet after Juliet's death, in the company of people who loved him and whom he received with the same characteristic combination of genuine warmth and ultimate distance. Jean Valjean spent his entire life becoming worthy of grace. Victor Hugo spent his entire life receiving it. The difference between those two men is not a flaw in the novel. It is, perhaps, the most interesting thing about both of them, and it is a question that the funeral crowds, however vast, however sincere, could not have answered. Because it was not the kind of question that crowds can answer. It was the kind of question that required, at minimum, a moment of genuine solitude and genuine honesty. And whether that moment came, in the end, is something that died with him. Victor Hugo died on the 22nd of May, 1885, in his apartment on the Avenue d'Eylau in Paris. He was 83 years old. The cause was pneumonia. He had been declining for several weeks, well enough at moments to receive visitors, then worse, then briefly steadied, then not. The pattern of the final illness was ordinary in the way that most deaths are ordinary, regardless of whose death it is. His last documented words, recorded by those at his bedside, were spoken in the particular darkness of a man whose mind was moving between the room and somewhere else. He said, "I see black light." It is the kind of final utterance that resists interpretation, not because it is obscure, but because it is too precise for any single reading to fully contain. A poet's last words, spoken in the condition between consciousness and its end. Whether it was vision or delirium, or something that has no adequate category is a question that cannot be answered. It remains, like so much of Victor Hugo, slightly beyond the reach of complete understanding. The state funeral that followed was unprecedented in French Republican history. His body lay in state beneath the Arc de Triomphe on the night of May 31st and the morning of June 1st. He was the first person so honored. The arch was draped in black. Torches burned through the night. A line of people wanting to pay their respects stretched for distances that contemporary accounts struggled to describe, without resorting to comparisons that would seem excessive if they were not documented by so many independent observers. On the 1st of June, the procession moved through Paris toward the Panthéon. The coffin was carried on a pauper's hearse, at Hugo's own written request. He had specified this in his will. Whatever pomp the state wished to provide, his own vehicle through the streets of Paris would be the simplest available. It was a gesture characteristic of the man in its simultaneous genuine humility and precise self-awareness. He knew the contrast would be noted. He knew it would be powerful. He chose it anyway, and it was both things at once. 2 million people lined the route. The Panthéon, on the left bank of Paris, is the building where France buries the people it has decided to define itself by. Voltaire is there, Rousseau, Marie Curie, Émile Zola. Hugo was placed among them in a crypt that still receives visitors from every country in the world. He had wanted this. He had wanted it with a patience and a consistency that spanned his entire adult life. He had organized his existence, his exile, his public positions, his refusals, his outputs, around the project of becoming permanent. And in the strictest sense, he had succeeded. The Panthéon is permanent in the way that very few human things are permanent. His name is on it. His presence is in it. The question the documentary opened with, and that the 2 million mourners in the street could not have answered, was what it had cost to get there. Not the political cost, not the literary effort, but the human cost. What had been paid, and by whom, in the construction of that monument. That accounting, which Hugo never fully performed himself, is the one the remaining sections attempt. Les Misérables has never gone out of print, not in French, not in English, not in any of the dozens of languages into which it has been translated since its publication in 1862. It has been continuously available, continuously read, continuously adapted and reinterpreted for over 160 years. That is not a common thing for any book. It is an almost singular thing for a novel of its length and complexity. The adaptations began almost immediately. Stage versions appeared in France within years of publication. Film versions began arriving in the silent era, and by the late 20th century, the count of screen adaptations had passed 50 and was still growing. The musical version, with music by Claude Michel Schoenberg and lyrics by Alain Boublil, opened in Paris in 1980, transferred to London's West End in 1985, and ran there for 16 years. It eventually became the longest-running musical in West End history. By the early 21st century, it had been seen by more than 70 million people worldwide. That number has continued to grow. What each generation finds in the novel is not quite what the previous generation found. Hugo's contemporaries read it primarily as a political document and a work of social advocacy. They argued about whether its portrait of the French penal system was accurate, and whether its indictment of poverty constituted a call for specific reforms or a more general moral challenge. They debated Valjean's theological dimensions, whether he represented a specifically Christian understanding of grace or something more universal. These were urgent questions in 1862, and the novel addressed them with enough specificity to sustain genuine debate. Later generations found other things. The Romantic era's confidence in individual moral transformation began to seem, by the late 19th century, slightly optimistic, and critics who came of age under naturalism, or then under the various disillusions of the 20th century, read Valjean's Arc with a more complicated set of questions. Was transformation of this kind actually possible? Was the novel's faith in individual goodness finally an evasion of structural analysis? Was Hugo's sentimentality, however brilliantly deployed, ultimately a way of making unjust conditions feel emotionally resolved rather than politically changed? These are legitimate questions. They have not diminished the novel's readership. They have enriched it. The musical brought the story to audiences who had never read the book and might never read it, and in doing so, it created a new population of readers who came to the novel from the songs, who encountered Fantine and Eponine and the Barricade of June 1832 as emotional experiences before they encountered them as literary ones. Whether this is how Hugo would have wanted his work to reach people is unknowable. What is knowable is that it has reached people, continuously, across every change of cultural climate and political circumstance that the past century and a half has produced. The book has outlasted every simplification that has been applied to it. Every reduction to a single theme, a single lesson, a single emotional note has eventually given way to a reading that found more in it than the reduction allowed. Perhaps because Hugo himself was too complicated to be reduced, even in his fiction. Even in a work of deliberate moral clarity, the complexity of his actual experience kept breaking through. The novel he had to write, the one that grew from the worst morning of his life, and from 20 years of private grief and public observation, turned out to be the thing that survived him most completely, not the speeches, not the political positions, not the public image that 2 million people had come into the streets to honor. The novel, the one about a man learning, at enormous cost, to become worthy of the grace he had been shown. The most revealing document in Victor Hugo's life is not Les Misérables. It is not the private notebooks or the political pamphlets, or the 17,000 letters that his correspondents produced over 7 decades. It is the pattern of what happened to the women who organized their lives around his. Not one woman, not an isolated case that can be explained by particular circumstances or particular failure of character. A pattern, consistent across different personalities, different relationships, different decades. Adele, his wife, entered the marriage with genuine feeling and remained in it for 46 years, in a condition that required her to disappear into the role of Hugo's wife rather than exist as a fully acknowledged person in her own right. The affair with Sainte-Beuve, whatever its precise dimensions, was at least partly a response to a marriage that had placed her permanently at the periphery of her husband's interior life. She died in Brussels, far from the Paris she had loved, formally honored and privately alone. Juliette spent 50 years in a relationship structured almost entirely around Hugo's needs and Hugo's schedule and Hugo's choices. She was brilliant enough to have had a significant theatrical career. She gave it up. She was devoted enough to have demanded something closer to equality. She did not demand it, or she demanded it in letters and then accepted its refusal. She was present at every important moment of his life, and acknowledged publicly at almost none of them. When she died, she was mourned by Hugo and described in the press as his longtime companion, which was accurate, and also an extraordinary understatement of what 50 years of daily devotion looks like when you are the one providing it. Leopoldine is the hardest case, because she is the case where Hugo was not the agent of the harm, but the one who suffered it alongside her. Her death was not his fault, but the manner in which he learned of it, traveling with his mistress while his daughter drowned in Normandy, carries a weight that the record does not let you fully set aside. He had been elsewhere, he was often elsewhere, and the grief he felt was genuine and overwhelming, and it does not resolve the question of what the pattern of his presence in her life and his absence had meant to her while she was alive. The younger Adele, who followed a man who did not love her across an ocean and lost her mind in the following, was perhaps the most extreme case of what it could mean to grow up in the atmosphere Hugo created. She had absorbed, from childhood, a sense of what the most important kind of love looked like. It was total, consuming, and organized around the needs of the person being loved, rather than the person doing the loving. She had learned that from watching her mother. She replicated it, in a more extreme and ultimately catastrophic form, in her own life. Modern scholars have argued this point carefully and at length. The question is not whether Hugo was a monster, because he was not. He was capable of real warmth. He was capable of genuine generosity, as the commune amnesty advocacy demonstrates. He was capable of love, in the specific sense that certain people mattered to him deeply, and their loss produced real suffering. The question is a more uncomfortable one: whether a man can be genuinely capable of love and simultaneously incapable of the sustained attentiveness, the daily willingness to register another person's experience as mattering, that love requires in order to be livable for the person receiving it, and whether the novels he wrote about mercy and grace were a form of compensation for something he could not manage to produce in the specific, unremarkable, undramatic daily circumstances of his own household. The novels were full of women who suffered beautifully in proximity to men who finally saw them or saw them too late. His own life produced suffering in the women around him that did not resolve into the beautiful clarity his fiction provided. Whether he ever noticed the structural resemblance between the two things is the question that neither the published work nor the private notebooks answer cleanly. We open this documentary with 2 million people in the streets of Paris, and a question, not the question the crowds were answering by their presence, which was simply, was this man important? He was, unambiguously. That question closed itself. The question was the other one, the one underneath. How does a man become the world's most celebrated writer about human compassion, while remaining, in his private life, so genuinely difficult to reach? Having followed his life from Besançon to Guernsey to the Panthéon, having looked at the notebooks and the letters and the pattern of what the people around him experienced, the answer is not the clean one that the monument invites you to believe. Hugo's compassion was not performed. That is the first thing to say, and it needs to be said clearly. The novels were not a disguise. His political courage, the exile, the commune amnesty advocacy, the decades of writing against capital punishment and poverty, and the mechanisms that crush the people the law was supposed to protect, that was not theatre. It was the expression of something he genuinely believed and was willing to pay a genuine price for. But compassion in the abstract and attentiveness to the specific person standing in front of you are not the same capacity, and Hugo had them in radically different proportions. He could hold the suffering of millions in his imagination and give it language that moved those millions to tears and to action. He could not consistently hold the particular daily needs of the particular people who loved him. The scale at which he operated was real, and it was also, in a way he may never have fully acknowledged, a way of never having to operate at the smaller, harder, less heroic scale of ordinary human intimacy. Jean Valjean understood this. That is the strange and somewhat devastating thing about Les Misérables. When you read it, knowing Hugo's life, Valjean's transformation is precisely a movement from the large and self-protective to the small and vulnerable. From the man who defines himself by his own suffering and his own strength to the man who can kneel on the floor of a room and simply be present to another person's need without converting that presence into something that serves himself. Hugo wrote that movement with extraordinary conviction and psychological precision. He wrote it. He gave it to his readers. He gave it to the world. And whether he ever made that particular journey himself is the question the documentary cannot answer, because the record does not answer it, and because it may be the kind of question that can only be answered from the inside. What we can say is this: he was a man of genuine greatness and genuine limitation, which is a combination considerably more interesting than greatness alone. The limitation does not diminish the achievement. Notre-Dame de Paris still stands, restored partly because of him. Les Misérables still moves people in ways that political arguments rarely manage. Les Contemplations still contains one of the most honest poems about grief in any language. La Légende des siècles still reaches towards something in the human record that most writers never attempt. Those things exist, they persist, they have done what Hugo wanted them to do, which is to outlast him. And the women who loved him, and the distance he maintained even while receiving their love, and the question of whether the novels were also a reckoning that could only happen on the page because it could not happen in the room, those things also exist in the record. They are part of the same life. They belong to the same man. The most human thing about Victor Hugo, finally, may be that he needed to write Les Misérables. That something in him understood the distance between who he was and who Valjean became, and could not close that distance in his own life, but could not stop reaching toward it either. Every page of that novel is a form of reaching. He gave the world a story about what it means to become worthy of the grace you have been shown. He spent his own life being shown grace and not quite managing the becoming. The gap between those two things is not a reason to dismiss him. It is the reason he is still interesting. It is, in the end, the most honest thing about him. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing to the channel. We explore lives that continue asking questions the world has not finished answering. And I am genuinely curious. Does knowing who Victor Hugo was in private change how you experience Les Misérables? Or does the novel stand entirely on its own, apart from the man who needed to write it? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and the conversation there is always worth having.